Nature shows no mercy in the Bitterroot Mountains, completely indifferent to whether you're a hardened trapper or a widow carrying a child. For Enoch Caldwell, hiring a cook was just a practical measure to survive the brutal winter. He never anticipated that the shivering woman turning up on his porch would introduce the one thing he genuinely feared: Grace. The year was 1883, and the Montana Territory was a place that chewed up the weak and swallowed them whole. Enoch Caldwell knew this better than anyone. At 38, he was a man carved from the very granite of the Bitterroot Range, broad-shouldered, heavily bearded, with eyes the color of a winter sky right before a blizzard. He had lived in self-imposed exile at his cabin near the old Abernathy claim for 6 years, trading pelts and panning just enough gold to keep himself in coffee, flour, and ammunition. Enoch didn't need people. But as the autumn leaves turned the color of dried blood, he realized he needed help. A severe bear attack late in the summer had left him with a lingering stiffness in his left shoulder. He could still hunt, chop wood, and haul water, but the daily, monotonous chores of survival, specifically the butchering, smoking, and cooking of his winter meat, alongside baking bread that didn't taste like river stones, were draining his reserves. On his final supply run down to the mining town of Bannack before the snows hit, Enoch pinned a piece of rough parchment to the notice board outside Mr. Hiram Peabody's mercantile. Wanted: cook and cabin keeper for the winter. Good wages paid in gold dust or coin. Room and board provided. No drinkers. Inquire with Enoch Caldwell at the end of the bar in the Skinner Saloon. He sat at that bar for 3 days. The only applicants were a drifter with a hacking cough and a prospector who smelled like he had bathed in kerosene. Disgusted, Enoch decided he would rather risk scurvy and starvation than share his peace with fools. On the morning of his departure, the sky was the color of bruised iron, promising snow. Enoch was tightening the cinch on his pack mule when a voice, soft but steady, broke through the sounds of the waking town. "Mr. Caldwell?" Enoch turned. Standing there was a woman who looked entirely out of place in the mud and muck of Bannack. She wore a faded gray wool coat that had seen better decades, let alone days, and a bonnet that hid the upper half of her face. But what caught Enoch's immediate attention was the undeniable, prominent swell of her belly beneath the heavy wool. "I'm Caldwell," Enoch grunted, his eyes narrowing. "What of it?" "Mr. Peabody told me you were looking for a cook," she said, taking a step forward. Her face caught the gray morning light. She was young, perhaps no more than 25, with pale skin, a sharp, elegant jawline, and dark, exhausted eyes. "My name is Isabella Higgins. I am a widow, and I am in need of the position." Enoch let out a harsh, barking laugh, shaking his head as he turned back to his mule. "The position is up at 7,000 feet, Mrs. Higgins. It ain't a parlor in Boston. I need someone who can haul a side of venison, pluck wild turkeys, and keep a fire going when the wind tries to rip the roof off. Not a woman who's about to drop a child in the middle of a blizzard. Go find a church charity." "There is no charity left in this town," Isabella said, her voice rising, devoid of hysteria but thick with a desperate iron that made Enoch pause. "And I am not due until late February. I am strong, Mr. Caldwell. I can bake, I can preserve meat, and I can keep a home from falling into ruin. I ask for half the wages you posted, but I require safe shelter." Enoch turned back, truly looking at her. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her cheek. She was shivering, though she tried to hide it. There was a bruise, fading to a yellowish green, on her lower jaw. It wasn't the kind of bruise a woman got from a clumsy fall. "The mountains are no place for a baby," Enoch warned, his voice dropping an octave. "If something goes wrong, there ain't no doctor. Just me, a hunting knife, and a lot of snow. If I stay in Bannack, Mr. Caldwell, I assure you, my child and I will not see the spring." The absolute certainty in her voice struck a chord deep within Enoch's buried conscience. He cursed under his breath, looking up at the threatening sky. The snow was already starting to fall, tiny white flakes catching in his beard. "Get your things," Enoch growled. "We have 20 miles of steep trail before nightfall. If you fall behind, I ain't waiting." Isabella Higgins simply nodded. She turned and retrieved a single, battered leather valise from the porch of the mercantile. It was all she had in the world. The ride up the mountain was brutal. Enoch rode his gelding and led the pack mule, while Isabella rode a rented roan mare that Enoch had grudgingly paid for. The temperature plummeted, and the trail grew treacherous, winding through dense stands of lodgepole pine and hugging the edges of sheer drops. Enoch checked over his shoulder repeatedly, expecting to see her weeping or begging to turn back. She never did. She gripped the pommel of her saddle with white-knuckled determination, her face a mask of stoic endurance. When they finally broke through the timberline and reached the small clearing where Enoch's heavy log cabin squatted against the side of the mountain, darkness had fallen. The snow was ankle-deep. Enoch helped her dismount, feeling the frailness of her arm beneath the thick coat. She was trembling violently, her lips blue. He pushed open the heavy oak door of the cabin. It was dark, freezing, and smelled of stale grease, cured tobacco, and wet dog. "Welcome to paradise," Enoch muttered, striking a match to light a kerosene lantern. Isabella stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The cabin was sturdy, built to withstand a siege of nature, but it was a chaotic mess of unwashed tin plates, scattered traps, and dirt on the floorboards. She didn't complain. She didn't cry. She slowly unbuttoned her coat, set her valise down, and looked at the cold stone hearth. "Where is the kindling, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked quietly. "I will start the fire, and then we will need to boil water." Enoch watched her, a strange, unfamiliar feeling tightening in his chest. He had expected a burden, but as he looked at the quiet determination of the pregnant widow standing in his ruined sanctuary, he realized he had just brought an entirely different kind of storm into his home. The first 2 weeks in the cabin were a silent war of wills and boundaries. Enoch was a man used to absolute silence, communicating mostly through grunts and the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood. Isabella, on the other hand, brought a rhythm of civilization that Enoch hadn't experienced since before the war between the states. Despite her condition, Isabella's work ethic was terrifying. Enoch would wake before dawn, intending to start the fire, only to find the hearth already roaring and the smell of strong chicory coffee filling the air. Within days, the cabin underwent a radical transformation. The floors were scrubbed with lye and sand until the pine boards shone. The thick layer of grease on the windows was wiped away, letting the harsh, brilliant winter sun flood the single room. But it was the food that completely undid Enoch's defenses. For years, his diet had consisted of charred meat, hardtack, and beans. On the 4th evening, Enoch returned from checking his trap line along the freezing creek to find Isabella pulling a cast-iron Dutch oven from the coals. Inside was a venison stew, thickened with root vegetables she had found in his root cellar, seasoned with wild thyme and sage she had gathered from the edges of the clearing before the snow buried them. Alongside it sat a loaf of golden, crusty sourdough bread. Enoch sat at the rough-hewn table, took a bite, and closed his eyes. The taste brought back a flood of memories he had spent years trying to drown in bad whiskey and isolation memories of a farmhouse in Ohio, a mother's laugh, a life before the violence of the frontier had hardened his soul. He opened his eyes to find Isabella watching him nervously, her hands resting on the swell of her belly. "Is it to your liking, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked softly. "It'll do," he grunted, unable to express the sudden lump in his throat. He tore off a piece of bread. "You didn't have to go through all this trouble. Meat on a spit keeps a man alive just fine." "Surviving is not the same as living, Mr. Caldwell," Isabella replied, taking her own seat across from him. "Food should nourish the spirit as well as the flesh." It was the first time she had spoken so philosophically. Enoch chewed in silence, watching her. As she reached across the table to move a tin cup, her sleeve rode up. Enoch froze. Circling her left wrist were dark, distinct bruises, shaped perfectly like the grip of a large man's hand. Enoch's eyes flicked from her wrist up to her face. Isabella caught his gaze, realized what he was looking at, and quickly pulled her sleeve down, a flush of deep shame coloring her pale cheeks. "Your husband," Enoch said, his voice dangerously low, the quiet rumble of a waking predator. "How did he die, Mrs. Higgins?" Isabella looked down at her stew. The cabin was dead silent, save for the crackle and pop of the pine logs in the hearth. "Arthur died of cholera," she said flatly, reciting a rehearsed line. In Virginia City. Cholera doesn't leave handprints on a woman's wrist, Enoch pushed, leaning forward. And it doesn't leave a fading bruise on her jaw. Nor does it send a pregnant widow fleeing into the mountains to cook for a stranger. Isabella's hands began to shake. She dropped her spoon with a clatter. My past is my own, Mr. Caldwell. I am fulfilling my duties here. The arrangement was for labor, not a confession. When a woman runs, someone usually follows, Enoch countered, his eyes hard. And out here, trouble doesn't knock on the door. It kicks it down. If someone is coming up this mountain looking for you, I need to know whose skull I'll be putting a Winchester round through. A tear slipped free from Isabella's eye, tracing a path down her cheek. The stoic facade finally cracked. She took a shuddering breath, wrapping her arms around her stomach as if shielding the child within. Arthur was not a good man, Isabella whispered, the words tumbling out as if the dam had finally broken. He was a gambler and a drunkard. He moved us from Chicago to the Montana Territory with promises of silver wealth. But he didn't dig. He played faro. She looked up at Enoch, her eyes wide with lingering terror. He didn't die of cholera, Enoch. He was shot in an alley behind a saloon in Virginia City. He owed a great deal of money to a man named Josiah Sterling. They call him Blackwood Sterling down in the valley. Enoch's jaw tightened. Even isolated in the mountains, the name Blackwood Sterling carried a foul stench. Sterling was a ruthless syndicate man, a land baron and loan shark who owned politicians in Helena and used hired guns to collect his debts. Arthur told Sterling he had hidden a strongbox of gold dust, Isabella continued, her voice trembling. It was a lie to buy time, but Sterling believed him. When Arthur was killed, Sterling's men came to my boarding house. They believed Arthur had told me where the gold was hidden. They tried to force the information out of me. She touched her wrist instinctively. I escaped through a back window into the freezing rain. I hid in a freight wagon bound for Bannack. And then I found your notice. Enoch sat back heavily in his wooden chair. The wind began to howl outside, rattling the heavy shutters. A pregnant widow was one thing. A pregnant widow being hunted by Blackwood Sterling's thugs was a death sentence. He should pack her up. He should wait for a break in the weather, ride her down to a stagecoach station, give her a handful of gold, and wash his hands of the whole affair. That was the smart thing to do. That was the survivor's way. But then he looked at the spotless cabin. He smelled the remnants of the incredible meal she had prepared. He looked at the gentle, terrified woman who had brought a sliver of grace into his harsh, brutal world, and he knew he couldn't send her away. Enoch slowly stood up. He walked over to the corner of the cabin, opened a heavy wooden chest, and pulled out a beautifully maintained Sharps buffalo rifle and a leather bandolier heavy with brass cartridges. He laid them on the table near the stew. "Mr. Caldwell?" Isabella asked, her eyes darting to the weapon. "What are you doing?" Enoch met her gaze, his winter sky eyes softening just a fraction. "Making sure the rifle is oiled," Enoch said gruffly. "Eat your stew, Isabella. Nobody comes up my mountain uninvited, and nobody touches you or that baby. Not while I have breath in my lungs." For the first time since she had arrived, Isabella Higgins smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but in the dim light of the cabin, it was the brightest thing Enoch had seen in years. By the second week of December, the Bitterroot Range was swallowed by a winter so ferocious it would be talked about in the territory for a decade. The snow did not merely fall, it drove down in blinding, sideways sheets, burying the landscape under 8 feet of suffocating white. The pine trees groaned and snapped under the weight of the ice, sounding like cannon fire in the dead of night. Inside the cabin, however, a profound and unexpected warmth had taken root. Enoch Caldwell, a man who had spent the last 6 years measuring his days by the traps he emptied and the pelts he cured, found himself measuring time by the steady, rhythmic scrape of Isabella's broom against the floorboards and the smell of roasting chicory. They were utterly isolated, cut off from the rest of the world by an impassable wall of winter. If Blackwood Sterling's men were looking for her, they would have to wait for the spring thaw. The mountain had become their fortress. The proximity forced a strange intimacy upon them. Enoch learned that Isabella was terrified of the dark. a remnant of her days hiding from her late husband's violent outbursts in Chicago. In response, Enoch began carving intricate, slow-burning tallow candles, ensuring the cabin was never entirely plunged into blackness. Isabella learned that Enoch was plagued by night terrors, ghosts from the bloody fields of Shiloh and Antietam that still hunted him in his sleep. When he woke up, thrashing and gasping for air, clutching blindly for a rifle that wasn't there, she didn't recoil. Instead, she would sit by the hearth, stoke the embers, and read aloud from a battered copy of John Milton's poetry she had brought in her valise. Her voice, steady, melodious, and filled with a quiet grace, would slowly pull the mountain man back from the edge of his madness. It was a domesticity Enoch had sworn he would never allow himself to need, yet he found himself drinking it in like a man dying of thirst. In late January, the true reality of their situation crested. Enoch was at the heavy oak table, meticulously cleaning the action of his Winchester 73, when Isabella suddenly gasped, dropping a tin plate onto the floor with a loud clatter. Enoch was out of his chair in a heartbeat, the rifle halfway to his shoulder, his eyes scanning the frosted windows for danger. "What is it? Are you hurt?" Isabella was leaning against the washstand, one hand braced on the wood, the other pressed tightly against the swell of her stomach. Her eyes were wide, but she wasn't crying in pain. A look of profound, terrified wonder washed over her face. "The baby," she breathed, looking up at him. "He's moving. It's the strongest he's ever kicked." Enoch slowly lowered the rifle, feeling foolish, yet his heart was hammering against his ribs. He approached her cautiously, as if approaching a wild, easily spooked mare. Isabella, acting on an instinct she couldn't quite name, took his rough, calloused hand, a hand that had taken lives and butchered elk, and placed it gently against the side of her woolen dress. Enoch held his breath. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, against the center of his palm, he felt a distinct, solid thump. Life. Stubborn, miraculous life, fighting to be known in a cabin, surrounded by deadly, freezing desolation. A lump the size of a walnut formed in Enoch's throat. He looked at Isabella, and in the golden light of the hearth, he saw past the bruises, past the fear, and saw the absolute, terrifying vulnerability of what she was about to face. "He's strong," Enoch murmured, his voice cracking slightly. He stepped back, pulling his hand away as if the heat of her skin had burned him. He cleared his throat, immediately retreating behind his walls of gruff practicality. "A strong boy will need a strong mother. You need to know how to protect him when I ain't here." He walked over to his footlocker and dug beneath a pile of heavy wool blankets. He pulled out a small, blued steel Smith & Wesson Model 1½ revolver. It was a 5-shot break top, small enough to fit in the pocket of an apron, but chambered in, 32 rimfire enough to stop a man dead at close range. He brought it to the table and broke the action open, showing her the empty cylinder. "Guns ain't just for men, Isabella. And out here, grace and poetry won't stop a starving wolf or a man with a black heart." Enoch laid 5 brass cartridges on the table. "I'm going to teach you how to load this. And tomorrow, we'll open the back shutter, and you're going to learn how to fire it until you can hit a pine cone at 20 paces. Over the next 2 weeks, the boom of the little revolver echoed across the snow-choked valley. Isabella hated the noise, hated the smell of sulfur and cordite, and hated the heavy, lethal weight of the iron in her hand. But she thought of Blackwood Sterling. She thought of the child in her womb. And so she leveled the barrel, squared her shoulders, and fired until her hands stopped shaking. Without realizing it, the mountain man was teaching the city widow how to survive, while the widow was slowly teaching the mountain man how to live. February arrived, and with it came the deceptive trickery of the mountains. A Chinook wind. For 3 days, warm, dry air swept down the eastern slopes of the Bitterroots. The temperature spiked by 30 degrees, melting the top layers of snow into slush and turning the frozen creeks into roaring, muddy torrents. To Isabella, it felt like a brief, glorious reprieve from the claustrophobia of winter. To Enoch, it felt like a warning bell. The thaw meant the lower passes were temporarily navigable. A determined rider could make it up the mountain. On the afternoon of the 4th day, The sky began to bruise purple again, signaling the return of the deep freeze. Enoch was outside, furiously chopping extra firewood to stockpile before the ice returned, while Isabella was inside baking biscuits. Suddenly, Enoch's scarred deerhound, Grizzly, who was chained beneath the overhang of the porch, let out a low, rumbling growl. The fur along the dog's spine stood straight up. Enoch drove his axe into the chopping block and went perfectly still, his head tilted, listening. Over the rush of the melting creek, he heard it. The rhythmic, wet crunch of hooves punching through the crust of the snow. Multiple horses. He sprinted for the cabin, bursting through the heavy oak door. Isabella spun around, her hands covered in flour. "Get away from the windows," Enoch barked, his voice stripped of all gentleness, replaced by the cold, metallic tone of a soldier. "Get against the far wall, behind the stone hearth. Now." He grabbed his Winchester from its pegs over the door, snatched his bandolier, and slammed the heavy wooden shutters shut over the front windows, plunging the cabin into twilight. He barred the door with a thick piece of milled lumber. "Enoch?" Isabella's voice pitched high with panic as she awkwardly lowered her heavily pregnant body to the floor behind the solid stone of the chimney. "Who is it?" "Company," he growled. He peered through a narrow gun slit carved into the timber beside the front door. 3 riders broke through the tree line, their horses blowing white plumes of steam from their nostrils. They were hard-looking men, dressed in heavy canvas dusters and thick furs. Enoch recognized the man in the center immediately. It was Elias Cobb, a notorious tracker and enforcer who operated out of Helena, a man known to do Blackwood Sterling's dirtiest work. To his left was a red-haired man carrying a terrifyingly large shotgun. They reined in about 40 yards from the cabin, just outside the effective range of a quick pistol shot, but well within the kill zone of a Winchester. "Caldwell!" Cobb's voice boomed across the clearing, laced with a sneering arrogance. "We know you're in there, and we know who you're harboring." Enoch didn't answer. He smoothly racked the lever of the Winchester, chambering around. The metallic clack-clack was the loudest sound in the cabin. "Word made it down to Bannack about a pregnant woman heading up your trail before the freeze," Cobb shouted, his horse dancing nervously in the snow. "Mr. Sterling wants the widow Higgins. He figures she knows where her dead husband buried his property. Send her out, Caldwell. We ain't got a quarrel with you. You hand her over, we leave you to your furs. You refuse, and we'll burn this cabin down around your ears and take her out of the ashes." Behind the hearth, Isabella let out a stifled sob, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at Enoch, her eyes silently pleading, terrified that the pragmatic mountain man would do the math and realize trading her was the only logical way to survive. Enoch looked back at her. He saw the woman who had scrubbed his floors, cooked his meals, and chased away his nightmares with poetry. He saw the mother of the child whose heartbeat he had felt against his own palm. Enoch jammed the barrel of his rifle through the gun slit. "You've got 5 seconds to turn those horses around, Cobb," Enoch roared back, his voice echoing off the timberline. "After that, I start putting holes in your lungs." "You're a fool, Caldwell," Cobb yelled, reaching for his hip. "Take him." The clearing erupted into deafening violence. The red-haired man spurred his horse forward, raising the shotgun, but Enoch fired first. The Winchester barked, spitting flame. The heavy 44-40 bullet struck the red-haired man square in the chest, blowing him clean out of the saddle to land in a crumpled, bloody heap in the slush. Cobb and the third rider instantly scattered, spurring their horses toward the cover of the thick pines on either side of the cabin, returning fire as they rode. Bullets thudded into the heavy logs of the cabin walls, splintering wood. One round smashed through the top of the shutter, raining glass down on the floorboards. "Keep your head down, Isabella," Enoch shouted over the din, tracking the third rider through the slit. He fired twice more. The horse screamed, and the rider pitched forward into the snow, scrambling frantically behind a deadfall for cover. Suddenly, a heavy, concussive boom echoed from the side of the cabin, completely missing the gun slit. Cobb wasn't shooting at Enoch. He was shooting off the iron hinges of the side window shutter. Crack! Crack! The wood splintered, and the shutter sagged. Enoch cursed, realizing his mistake. Cobb was flanking them. Enoch abandoned the front door and moved toward the side window, levering another round into the chamber. As he stepped across the room, the heavy side door, which Enoch rarely used and hadn't fully reinforced, shuddered violently beneath the weight of a booted kick. The frame groaned. Another kick, and the lock tore free from the pine frame. The door slammed open. Elias Cobb stood in the doorway, a Colt peacemaker leveled directly at Enoch's chest. Before Enoch could bring the long barrel of the Winchester around in the tight space, Cobb fired. The impact spun Enoch around like a rag doll. The bullet tore through the meaty part of his left shoulder, the same shoulder the bear had mauled months ago, shattering his collarbone and exiting his upper back. Enoch hit the floor hard, his rifle clattering out of reach. He gasped, blinding pain radiating through his entire body, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. Cobb stepped into the cabin, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He stepped over Enoch's bleeding form, his boots leaving wet, muddy tracks on Isabella's pristine floorboards. He cocked the hammer of his revolver, his eyes scanning the dim room until they landed on the stone hearth. "Come on out, widow," Cobb sneered, stepping toward the chimney. "Sterling wants to have a word with you." Isabella stood up from behind the stonework. She was trembling so violently she could barely stand, but her face was eerily calm, stripped of all tears. Cobb sneered, lowering his gun an inch, anticipating an easy surrender. "There's a good girl. Now get your coat." "Mr. Cobb," Isabella said, her voice dropping into a deadly, icy register that Enoch had never heard before. She raised her right hand from behind the folds of her flower-covered apron. The blued steel of the little Smith & Wesson gleamed in the dim light. Before Cobb could react, before his brain could register that the terrified, pregnant widow was armed, Isabella squeezed the trigger. Bang! Bang! The sharp cracks of the .32 caliber revolver were shockingly loud. She didn't flinch. She had aimed exactly where Enoch had taught her, center mass. Both bullets struck Cobb in the throat and upper chest. He dropped his Colt, his hands flying to his neck as blood geysered through his fingers. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing onto the floorboards, dead before his head hit the ground. Silence crashed back into the cabin, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of Enoch's ragged breathing and the distant whinny of a terrified horse outside. Isabella stood frozen for a second, staring at the dead man. Then the Smith & Wesson slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. She rushed to Enoch, falling to her knees beside him, her flour-stained hands pressing desperately against the bleeding wound in his shoulder. "Enoch! Enoch! Hold on!" she choked out, tearing a strip from the hem of her apron to pack the wound. "I have to stop the bleeding." Enoch gritted his teeth, his vision swimming, but he managed to force a weak, bloody grin. You hit the pine cone." "Isabella, hush. Save your strength," she ordered, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks as she tied the makeshift bandage tight. Suddenly, Isabella gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that had nothing to do with the gunshot or the dead men. She doubled over, clutching her massive belly, her face draining of all color. "Isabella?" Enoch groaned, trying to push himself up on his good arm. "What is it?" She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a new, terrifying agony. Beneath her knees, a small pool of water began to spread across the floorboards, mixing with the flour and the blood. "The baby," Isabella whispered, a shudder tearing through her spine as the first massive contraction hit. "Enoch, it's time." The sharp scent of gun smoke and spilled blood hung heavy in the freezing cabin, but Enoch had no time to bleed, and Isabella had no time to panic. Through the splintered gun slit, Enoch caught a fleeting glimpse of the third rider. The man had seen Elias Cobb fall, seen the red-haired thug dead in the slush, and his courage had entirely evaporated. He scrambled onto Cobb's terrified gelding and spurred the animal mercilessly back down the treacherous, melting trail, leaving his partners to the mountain's judgment. The threat was gone, but the true crucible had just begun. "Enoch!" Isabella gasped, her fingers digging into the floorboards as another mammoth contraction seized her body. "It's too early. It's barely February. Babies don't read calendars," Isabella, Enoch gritted out. He unbuckled his heavy leather belt with his one good hand, biting back a roar of agony as the movement pulled at his shattered collarbone. He looped the leather over his neck and strapped his left arm tightly to his chest, creating a makeshift sling to staunch the bleeding and keep the useless limb out of the way. "Can you walk?" he asked, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. "I have to," she whispered fiercely. With Enoch supporting her waist with his right arm, they staggered away from Cobb's lifeless body and the pool of blood, moving toward the heavy timber bed in the corner of the room. Outside, the Chinook wind howled, rattling the broken shutters and threatening to plunge the cabin into freezing darkness. Once Isabella was on the bed, Enoch went to work. He was a man who had gutted bull elk, amputated a shattered leg on the battlefield at Antietam, and delivered breechfuls in the dead of winter. But as he stoked the hearth fire one-handed and set a clean pot of water to boil, his hands trembled. This wasn't survival. This was creation, happening right in the middle of a slaughterhouse. Hours bled into a grueling, agonizing twilight. The cabin grew bitterly cold as the icy draft whipped through the broken doorframe, but the space around the hearth and the bed became a sweat-soaked sanctuary. Isabella fought with a terrifying, silent intensity. She didn't scream like the women Enoch had heard in the city hospitals. She bit down on a piece of clean saddle leather, channeling every ounce of her trauma, her fear, and her fierce maternal instinct into bringing her child into the world. "You're doing fine, Isabella," Enoch kept murmuring, his deep voice a steady anchor in the storm of her pain. He bathed her forehead with a warm cloth, ignoring the throbbing agony in his own shoulder. By midnight, exhaustion was setting in. Isabella's skin was the color of old parchment, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Enoch," she panted, her eyes fluttering shut. "I can't. I haven't the strength. If I fade, you take him. You protect him from Sterling." "You ain't fading," Enoch growled, leaning close, his bearded face inches from hers. His blue eyes blazed with an unyielding fire. "You took on Blackwood Sterling's worst. You crossed the Bitterroots in a blizzard. You saved my life today, Isabella Higgins. You are the strongest creature on this mountain, and you are going to finish this." As if summoned by his raw command, Isabella's eyes snapped open. A primal, guttural cry tore from her throat, drowning out the shrieking wind outside. She bore down with a strength that defied her exhausted frame. Enoch positioned his large, calloused hands. "One more! Isabella! Push!" With a final, shattering exertion, the child slipped into Enoch's waiting hands. But the cabin remained terrifyingly silent. Enoch's heart plummeted into his stomach. The infant was entirely still, its tiny limbs blue and limp. Isabella collapsed back onto the pillows, gasping, waiting for the sound that every mother hungers for. "Enoch?" she whispered, panic slicing through the haze of exhaustion. "Why isn't he crying?" Enoch didn't answer. He couldn't. Working purely on instinct, he cleared the infant's tiny mouth with his finger. He turned the child over, supporting the fragile chest, and firmly rubbed the baby's back with his rough palm. Nothing. Desperation clawed at Enoch's throat. He refused to let death claim a victory in this room tonight. He brought his face close to the infant's, covering the tiny mouth and nose with his own, and breathed a gentle, measured puff of warm air into the child's lungs. He pulled back and rubbed the baby's back again, harder this time. "Breathe." He prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in 2 decades. "Take my breath if you have to. Just let this child breathe." Suddenly, the tiny chest hitched. A small gasp filled the quiet room, followed by a wet, coughing sputter, and then a cry. It started small, like the mewling of a kitten, but quickly escalated into a furious, robust wail that bounced off the pine logs and shattered the silence of the Bitterroot winter. Enoch fell back on his heels, a ragged sob tearing from his own chest. Tears, hot, unfamiliar, and entirely unashamed, spilled over his eyelids and tracked down through the grit and dried blood on his cheeks. He quickly wrapped the squalling infant in a warmed, soft flannel blanket he had set aside. "You were wrong about one thing, Mr. Caldwell," Enoch choked out, a watery, brilliant smile breaking across his weathered face as he turned to the bed. Isabella reached out her trembling arms. "What is it?" "It ain't a strong boy to help me chop wood," Enoch said softly, placing the bundled infant onto Isabella's chest. It's a fierce little girl. Isabella looked down at her daughter, her tears falling freely now, washing away the terror of the past year. She pressed her lips to the baby's warm head, overwhelmed by the absolute perfection of the moment. She looked up at Enoch, taking in his pale face, his blood-soaked sling, and the raw, unguarded devotion shining in his winter sky eyes. "Grace," Isabella whispered, her fingers tracing the baby's tiny cheek. "We will name her Grace, for she is what saved us both." By the time the spring thaw fully claimed the mountain in late April, the bodies of Elias Cobb and his partner were buried deep beneath the pines, marked only by river stones. Word eventually drifted up from the valley that Blackwood Sterling had been killed in a dispute over a rigged faro game in Helena. The ghost that had chased Isabella to the mountains was dead. She could have packed her bags. She had her health, her beautiful daughter Grace, and the roads were clear. But when Enoch Caldwell, his shoulder healed into a stiff but functional scar, finally found the courage to ask her to stay not as his cook, but as his wife Isabella, didn't hesitate. She looked at the man who had fought for her, bled for her, and breathed life into her daughter, and she gave him her hand. They were married by a traveling circuit judge in Bannack exactly 1 week later. The legend of the Bitterroot Shootout echoed across the Montana Territory, but the real story remained hidden within the cabin's rebuilt walls. Enoch Caldwell didn't just hire a cook, he found his salvation. Isabella transformed a hardened mountain man with her unyielding courage, while he gave her the fierce protection she needed. Together, born from winter's blood and snow, they forged a family rooted in survival, love, and extraordinary grace.
Hi, my name is Ivy Duck Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Duck Devotion. After watching the video, Mountain Man hired a pregnant widow to cook, but received a woman who taught him grace. I really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the quiet kindness between two people who were both carrying their own loneliness in different ways. The story didn't rely on huge dramatic moments to feel emotional. Instead, it showed how patience, understanding, and simple everyday care can slowly change someone's heart. I think that's what made their connection feel meaningful. Do you think the mountain man expected his life to change when he opened his door to her? Or did it happen little by little without him realizing it? And if you were in her position, would you have trusted someone new after going through so much loss? Stories like this remind me that sometimes healing begins in ordinary moments, not perfect ones. If this story meant something to you or left you thinking about the characters afterward, I really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional mountain man stories like this, feel free to like or subscribe if you'd like to see more from Ivy Duck Devotion.